Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are opening up a really monumental historical text by Jonathan Israel. It's called The Dutch Republic, Its Rise, Greatness, and Fall, 1477 to 1806.
Right, it's a massive book.
It really is a dense stack of historical research, and we're taking all of this to answer one seemingly impossible question for you.
Yeah, it's a fascinating puzzle.
So imagine looking at a political map of Europe in the late 16th century. You've got these sprawling, highly centralized, heavily armed empires dominating the landscape.
Big players.
Right. The formidable Spanish Empire, the vast Kingdom of France, the Holy Roman Empire. And then nestled up in this northwestern corner, right against the freezing, violent waters of the North Sea, there's this tiny, waterlogged patch of marshland.
Barely even solid ground in some place.
Exactly. The population is barely touching 2 million people. It's just a fraction of the size of its neighbors. And yet, this seemingly insignificant speck of mud and water somehow manages to completely dominate global trade.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. I mean, it builds the world's most powerful navy. It produces this staggering, unprecedented concentration of intellectual and artistic genius. Rembrandt, Spinoza, Grotius.
Yeah, heavy hitters.
And it does all of this without a king. In an era where absolute monarchy was like the undisputed gold standard for running a successful state, they had this bizarre, fragmented, leaderless system.
It is arguably one of the most profound historical paradoxes of the early modern world. I mean, you are looking at a society that, by all conventional rules of historical development, simply should not have survived.
Let alone thrived the way they did.
Right. A fragmented, decentralized cluster of provinces achieving global hegemony in an age of absolutist nation-states is it's like watching a chaotic, loosely organized neighborhood watch program somehow dismantle a global military superpower.
That's a great way to put it.
And then, accidentally inventing modern capitalism along the way.
Yeah, just as a side project. So our mission with these sources isn't to get bogged down in the endless, muddy battlefield tactics of the early Dutch revolt against Spain.
No, that would take weeks.
Instead, we need to track the full trajectory of the Republic to understand the underlying mechanics of this Dutch miracle. We want to synthesize how their incredibly unique political decentralization, their absolute dominance of global commerce, and their cultural golden age were inextricably linked.
They're all tied together. You can't have one without the others.
Exactly. So we are going to track this through 4 massive shifts. We'll start with the foundation, the deep roots of how they broke away.
The origin story.
Right. Then we'll hit the explosive economic miracle of the early Golden Age. From there, we follow them to the absolute zenith of their power, which immediately triggers a catastrophic existential disaster.
Yeah, things go downhill fast.
And finally, we'll examine the long, slow, absolute contraction of their economy and how this incredible experiment just unraveled. And if you are sitting there wondering how a tiny marshland pulls this off, the sources suggest we have to go back long before the famous revolt of the 1570s.
Oh, way back.
We have to look at the mud itself.
We really do. Because the separation between the North, what we now call the modern Netherlands, and the South, which is modern Belgium, was not just some sudden political accident born out of a religious war with Spain.
It wasn't just a spontaneous split.
No, not at all. The roots of this duality go all the way back to the 13th century, and it is entirely about geography and, hydrology.
Not hydrology, like water management.
Exactly. If you look at the map before the year 1200, areas like Holland, Zeeland, and parts of Friesland were essentially dangerous, thinly populated, waterlogged peat bogs.
Basically a giant swamp.
Yeah, they were completely marginal. The economic and demographic center of gravity in the Low Countries was entirely in the south and the east, on the higher solid ground.
Where you can actually build things.
Right, where you could reliably grow crops and build stone cities without them just, sinking into the mud.
So the North is basically a swamp that no one really cares about. What changes?
Human engineering on a massive scale. During the 13th century, the people living in these northern marshes begin systematic diking and land reclamation projects.
Okay, so they start fighting back against the water.
And we have to understand the mechanics of this. They aren't just building a few walls. They are digging drainage canals, inventing new types of sluices, and later using windmills to constantly pump water out of the lowlands.
So they're actively changing the landscape.
They are literally draining the swamps to create cultivable land. But here's the fascinating unintended consequence of all this.
What happens?
Well, when you drain a peat bog, the peat oxidizes, and the land physically sinks.
Wait, seriously? So by trying to create dry land, they're actually lowering the elevation of their own country below sea level.
Yes,
That sounds like a recipe for a catastrophic flood.
it was. It was a constant existential threat. And that threat forced a profound social change. I mean, you cannot manage a complex system of dikes and drainage canals if everyone is just looking out for their own farm.
Right, water doesn't respect property lines. If your neighbor's wall breaks, your farm floods too.
Exactly. So these northern communities were forced to create local water boards.
Water boards.
Yeah, they were cooperative, decentralized councils where towns and farmers had to work together. They had to vote on taxation and manage the infrastructure just to prevent drowning.
Wow.
This birthed a culture of deep civic cooperation, negotiation, and local self-reliance centuries before any formal republic ever existed.
So the physical environment literally shapes their political DNA. They're building their country and their governing philosophy out of the mud.
It's true. It starts at the local level.
Now, politically, the sources point to a massive foundational moment in 1477, something called the Grand Privilege. But the text also notes it was almost immediately ignored by the rulers. Why are we talking about a failed document?
Because of its immense psychological power. It's super important. In 1477, the Low Countries were ruled by the Habsburgs, specifically a young, vulnerable ruler named Mary of Burgundy.
Okay, so she's in charge.
Right. But she had just taken power, her father had been killed in battle, and the French were actively threatening to invade.
A tough spot to be in.
Very.
Yeah.
And the various provinces and cities saw her weakness and, well, they essentially extorted her.
Oh, wow.
They forced her to sign the Grand Privilege, which is a sweeping concession of rights. It guaranteed that the provinces had to be consulted on taxes, they had to approve declarations of war, and crucially, that local laws and customs would always supersede central edicts from the crown.
It sounds like a massive victory for local government.
On paper, yes, absolutely. But the Habsburgs quickly regained their military footing in the following years and practically tore the document up.
Of course they did.
Yeah, they went right back to centralizing power. However, the idea of the Grand Privilege became an indestructible political myth.
I picture this like a prenuptial agreement that one partner managed to wrangle during a moment of crisis, right? And even though the other partner completely ignores it and runs the household anyway, the first partner keeps framing it on the wall, pointing at it and saying, look, we have a legal right to independence.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. It provided the ideological vocabulary for opposition.
So they never forgot it.
Never.
Oh.
For the next 100 years, whenever the wealthy towns or the local nobility felt the central government in Brussels or Madrid was overstepping, they didn't just complain. They pointed back to 1477.
They pull out the receipt.
Exactly. They argued that a consultative, decentralized government wasn't some radical new idea, but their ancient, legally binding right. It really set the stage for the massive explosion that comes later in the 16th century, the revolt against Spain.
Let's get into that revolt. So King Philip II of Spain, who now rules the area, is trying to centralize power and crush the rising tide of Protestantism.
Right. He wants total control and Catholic uniformity.
And the Low Countries rebel. But the way this rebellion actually plays out perfectly illustrates that old north-south divide we just talked about. The sources describe the southern provinces as being completely paralyzed by internal divisions and these massive head towns. What was going on in the south?
So in the southern provinces like Flanders and Brabant, you had massive, incredibly wealthy medieval metropolises, cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Antwerp.
Big, powerful cities.
Huge.
Yeah.
And over the centuries, these cities had acquired absolute dominance over their surrounding rural quarters. They were called head towns because they basically dictated everything that happened in their region.
Okay.
And they fiercely guarded their independence, not just from the Spanish king, but from each other.
Ah, so they didn't play well together.
Not at all.
So if you are trying to organize a unified national rebellion against the greatest military machine on earth, and you have to rely on Ghent and Antwerp?
You fail.
Well,
Because they despise each other.
yeah.
I mean, if Ghent wanted to march an army east, Antwerp would veto it just to weaken Ghent.
That is wild.
Every major city acted like its own sovereign nation. And the Spanish military commander, the Duke of Parma, recognized this immediately.
He saw the weakness.
He didn't have to defeat the entire South in one massive battle. He just exploited their rivalries, isolated them one by one, and reconquered them.
Like a board of directors where everyone has veto power and absolutely nothing gets done. But the North avoids this trap. Is this because of those water boards? Did the mud actually save them?
Indirectly, yeah, yes it did. Because Holland had grown up differently out of that reclaimed land, its cities were more numerous, but individually less dominant.
So no single giant city bullying everyone else.
Right. You had Amsterdam, Leiden, Haarlem, Delft, Gouda, all relatively close together, none of them powerful enough to completely subjugate the others, and all of them used to cooperating on water management.
They had practiced compromising.
Exactly. They had to compromise to survive. So, as the South collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance and Spanish sieges, Holland stepped into the leadership vacuum.
So the North takes charge of the rebellion.
Yes, the revolt ends up severing the Low Countries. The North becomes Protestant and independent, the South stays Catholic and Spanish.
But the religious split just put a permanent seal on a political and economic divergence that had been brewing since the 1200s.
Precisely. It was a long time coming.
Now, I find it fascinating that even after breaking away from Spain, they didn't actually want to be a republic. Like, that wasn't the goal. They were terrified of being independent.
Completely terrified. You have to remember, in the 1580s, the concept of a republic wasn't a badge of honor. It meant instability and chaos.
It was like a failed state.
Right. A legitimate state needed a monarch. So, after their primary leader, William the Silent, was assassinated, they went shopping for a new king.
Well, literally shopping for a monarch.
Yes, they offered the sovereignty of their country to the French king, who, frankly, bungled the military campaign. Then, in 1585, they turned to Queen Elizabeth I of England in sheer desperation.
And Elizabeth doesn't want to be their queen, but she sends her favorite courtier, the Earl of Leicester, to be a protector general. And this turns into an absolute catastrophe.
A total disaster.
Walk me through the mechanics of Leicester's failure, because this seems like the exact moment the Dutch psychology fundamentally snaps.
So, Leicester arrives and immediately acts like an absolute monarch. He tries to centralize taxation. He tries to ban trade with the enemy.
Wait, the Dutch were trading with the enemy?
Yes. They relied on trading with Spain to fund their own war effort against Spain.
That is uniquely Dutch.
Very pragmatic. So Leicester tries to ban that and dictate military strategy. But he instantly collides with the Holland regents.
Let's clarify who these regents are for the listener. We aren't talking about aristocrats with giant castles, right?
No, not at all. These are wealthy, pragmatic merchants, brewers, and shipping magnates who sit on the city councils. They are men who balance ledgers for a living.
Businessmen.
Exactly. And they are horrified by Leicester's arrogance and his financial incompetence. When they resist him, Leicester tries a remarkably cynical and dangerous strategy.
What does he do?
He realizes he can't beat the regents legally, so he tries to overthrow them using a proxy mob.
He uses the Flemish refugees. This blew my mind when I read it. He takes the immigrants who fled the Spanish conquest in the South and turns them into a weapon against his own host country.
Exactly. Thousands of strict militant Calvinists had fled the South and settled in northern cities like Leiden and Amsterdam.
Because the Spanish took over their homes.
Right. They were radicalized, having lost everything to the Catholic Spanish, and they hated the pragmatic, moderate Holland regents who were, perfectly willing to trade with Spain if it made a profit.
Regents were too moderate for them.
Leicester allies himself with these radical immigrant preachers and attempts to stage violent coups inside the city governments.
That is incredibly bold and incredibly foolish. I mean, he is a foreign guest trying to incite a civil war in the middle of an invasion.
It was a massive miscalculation. The Holland regents were simply too entrenched. In Leiden, the conspiracy is uncovered, the conspirators are arrested, and the city council publicly beheads Leicester's main supporters.
Wow. They did not mess around.
No, they didn't. Leicester realizes he has completely lost control, gives up in absolute disgust, and sails back to England in 1587.
And this is the psychological snap. There's an amazing quote in the sources from an English diplomat named Thomas Wilkes. He's observing the Dutch shortly after Leicester leaves, and he writes to London, warning them that the Dutch, quoting here, tasting the sweetness of their liberty, hate to be subject not only to a Spaniard, but to any kingly government.
That is the definitive turning point. They look at the Spanish tyranny, they look at the French incompetence, they look at the English subversion, and they finally realize relying on a foreign monarch is just as dangerous as fighting one.
They're done with kings.
They stop looking for a king. The regents of Holland step up and say, we are going to run this state ourselves as a union of sovereign provinces.
So the Republic is officially born out of exhaustion and distrust of monarchs.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so by 1588, they have survived the Habsburgs, they've kicked out the English, and they have secured this bizarre, localized, decentralized political framework They're independent.
They're on their own.
But if you are sitting at home looking at your bank account, you know that political independence doesn't pay the rent.
It definitely doesn't.
You can have all the liberty and decentralization in the world, but if you're a tiny marshland at war with the greatest empire on Earth, how do you suddenly afford to become the richest nation on the planet?
And that brings us to the explosion of the early 1590s, the beginning of the early Golden Age. Because what happens next is nothing short of an economic miracle.
The second pillar.
Yes. It is the sudden, explosive rise of Dutch world trade primacy.
How sudden is this? Are we talking decades of slow growth?
No, we are talking almost overnight in historical terms. In the late 1580s, the Republic's economy was squeezed, they were losing territory, and it looked really grim.
So what changed?
Between 1590 and 1595, a perfect convergence of geopolitical factors ignites a massive boom. First, Leicester is gone, so the internal political chaos stabilizes.
Okay, internal peace.
Second, the Spanish King Philip II makes a massive strategic blunder. He is fighting wars in France and against England simultaneously, and Spain faces a massive famine.
He's stretched too thin.
Way too thin. He desperately needs grain from the Baltic region. And who controls the shipping of Baltic grain?
The Dutch. So wait, the Spanish king lifts the trade embargo on Dutch ships so they can bring him food.
Yes,
He is literally paying the people he is trying to conquer because he needs their logistics network.
precisely. The infusion of Spanish silver back into the Dutch economy is a massive stimulus.
Yeah.
But the real game changer is what the Dutch are doing to their old rivals in the south.
Ah, Antwerp.
While Spain controls Antwerp, the Dutch control the mouth of the Scheldt River. That's the only waterway connecting Antwerp to the ocean.
So they have the choke point.
And they use it. The Dutch deploy their shallow draft warships and institute a brutal, suffocating naval blockade. They shut Antwerp down completely.
If I can use a modern analogy here, imagine a vibrant, massive tech hub like a modern-day Silicon Valley suddenly being completely cut off from the internet by a military blockade. What happens to all the software engineers, the venture capitalists, the logistics experts?
They flee. They pack up their capital, their skills, and their international contacts, and they move to the closest safe haven that will actually let them work.
Which is the north?
In this case, that was the cities of Holland and Zeeland. Amsterdam, Leiden, Middelburg. They absorbed tens of thousands of highly skilled, wealthy Southern refugees.
You get this instantaneous influx of the exact skills and money needed to launch a global monopoly.
It's an incredible brain drain. Urbanization skyrockets, wages jump, and entirely new industries are born almost overnight.
What kind of industries?
Well, before this blockade, the Dutch were mostly doing what historians call bulk carrying, just moving low-margin goods like grain and timber. But this southern brain drain allows them to pivot aggressively into the rich trades.
The luxury stuff.
High-margin goods, spices from the east, fine textiles, refined sugar, diamonds. And they don't just ship them, they build massive processing industries.
Like factories.
Yeah, they take raw sugar from Brazil, refine it in dozens of factories in Amsterdam, and sell the finished product back to Europe at a massive markup. They become the chief emporium, the middleman for the entire continent.
So the wealth is pouring in like a tidal wave.
It is unprecedented.
But if I'm looking at how this government actually runs, it sounds like a logistical nightmare. You have all this wealth, a booming global trade network, an active, bloody war against Spain, and yet no king, no president, no central executive department. How did the federal state, the States General, actually pass a law or fund a war?
By design, it was a system of constant, localized gridlock.
That sounds terrible for running a war.
It was tough. You have to understand that sovereignty, the ultimate legal authority, did not reside in the national government in The Hague. It resided in the individual provinces, Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Friesland, and so on.
So the provinces hold the power.
Exactly. They sent delegates to the States General, but those delegates were basically just messengers. They couldn't make independent decisions.
Wait, really? So if a major issue came up, like signing a treaty or raising a new tax to buy warships, what did they do?
The delegates had to ride back to their home provinces, consult their city councils, and then return to The Hague to vote.
That sounds incredibly slow. What if there is an emergency?
It was slow. And worse, major decisions required unanimous consent.
Wait, unanimous? Like 100% agreement. So the tiny rural province of Overijssel could veto the entire national war effort if they just didn't want to pay for it.
Technically, yes, which sounds paralyzing, and in many ways it was. But there was a massive practical reality that overrode the legal gridlock.
Let me guess. Money.
Money. The province of Holland was so incredibly wealthy, from this new trade boom that it contributed nearly 60% of the entire federal budget.
60%.
Yeah. When you pay for 6 out of every 10 soldiers, your opinion carries a lot of weight.
The golden rule, whoever has the gold makes the rules.
Exactly. And Holland was led by its chief legal officer, a brilliant, tireless political operator named Johan van Oldenbarnevelt.
Oldenbarnevelt.
He essentially bullied, cajoled, and bankrolled the other provinces into following Holland's foreign policy. He was the architect of the pragmatic merchant state.
Okay, so Oldenbarnevelt and the civilian merchants are holding the purse strings, but they aren't leading troops into battle. Who is commanding the army?
The military was commanded by a figure called the stadtholder. And the stadtholder was almost always a prince of the House of Orange.
So a noble.
In this era, it was Moritz of Nassau, the son of William the Silent. Now, legally speaking, the stadtholder was just a public servant. He was an employee hired by the provincial assemblies to lead the army and fleet.
But I'm guessing a Prince of Orange doesn't act like a simple employee.
Not at all. Moritz was the highest-ranking noble in the land. He was a brilliant military reformer who professionalized the army.
Right.
He commanded the absolute, fanatical loyalty of the troops. He held court in The Hague, surrounded by French and German aristocrats, behaving very much like a king in waiting.
Okay, I see the collision course here. You have a wealthy, pragmatic, civilian merchant class managing the money, and an aristocratic, heavily armed military hero commanding the troops. That is a structural ticking time bomb.
It was. And the bomb detonates, ironically, during a period of peace.
When you'd least expect it.
In 1609, Oldenbarnevelt pulls off a massive diplomatic victory. He negotiates the 12 years truce with Spain.
So they take a break from the war.
It formally recognizes the Republic as a legitimate state and brings an even bigger economic boom. But without the external pressure of the Spanish armies threatening their borders, the internal fault lines fracture completely.
This brings us to the ideological civil war. And this part of the deep dive completely threw me. The conflict that almost destroys the country is centered around a theological debate about predestination.
Yes.
If I am an Amsterdam merchant making millions in the spice trade, why on earth do I care about an academic debate over whether God preordains salvation?
Because in the 17th century, theology is politics. Let's break down the two sides because it reveals everything about how power worked.
Okay, who are the players?
You have the Remonstrants, also known as Arminians, and the Counter-Remonstrants, or Gomarists. On a purely theological level, the Arminians favored a slightly more moderate interpretation of predestination. They argued that humans have a sliver of free will in accepting God's grace.
And the other side?
The Gomarists were orthodox, hardline Calvinists who believed in absolute, unalterable predestination.
But the theology is really just a proxy war for who runs the cities.
Right, exactly. The core issue was church-state relations. The Arminians believed that the church should be subordinate to the secular government.
Meaning the merchants are in charge.
Right. They believed the city magistrates, the wealthy regents, should have the power to appoint ministers and enforce religious tolerance to keep the peace, which, is good for business.
And the Orthodox Gomarists.
They believed the church must be completely independent of the state, and that the state's only job was to act as the enforcer for the true Orthodox religion, stamping out heresy and Catholicism.
So naturally, Oldenbarnevelt and the wealthy Holland regents back the Arminians. They want to maintain control over their cities and prevent radical populist preachers from whipping up mobs and dictating civic life.
Makes sense for them.
But where does Moritz, the military commander, land?
Moritz aligns himself with the Orthodox Counter-Remonstrants.
Interesting.
Now, there is debate over how deeply he cared about the theological nuances, but politically, it was a masterstroke, because the Orthodox preachers commanded the loyalty of the popular masses, the craftsmen, the sailors, and crucially, the rank-and-file soldiers. By backing them, Moritz gains a massive popular power base to challenge the elite Holland regents.
It's the classic populist military leader using religious zealots to attack the wealthy elite. And the sources detail how this culminates in a total showdown in 1618. How does Moritz actually execute this?
He uses the one thing Oldenbarnevelt doesn't have: hard military power. Moritz systematically tours the cities of Holland with his troops. He uses his authority to dismiss the local city militias, purges the city councils of any Arminian regents, and replaces them with his own Orthodox loyalists.
Wow, just sweeping through the cities.
It is a slow-motion, bloodless coup d'etat.
And what happens to Oldenbarnevelt, the man who basically built the state's financial and political structure?
Moritz has him arrested for treason. He convenes a special court stacked with his enemies, and in 1619, the 71-year-old Oldenbarnevelt is publicly beheaded in the Binnenhof in The Hague.
That is a stunning, brutal end for the architect of their independence.
It transformed the Republic. Jonathan Israel describes the resulting government as a quasi-republican Caesarian system.
Caesarian, like Julius Caesar.
Right. It wasn't officially a monarchy, but more it's held the true reins of power through his control of the army and the purged city councils.
Now, in the aftermath of this, the surviving regents needed a way to justify their right to rule, right? To prove that they weren't just a bunch of greedy merchants, but the rightful rulers of the land. And they turned to a man whose name is still massive in international law today, Hugo Grotius.
Yes, Grotius.
What is this Batavian myth he creates?
Well, Grotius was a brilliant legal mind and an ally of Oldenbarnevelt who actually barely escaped the purges himself. He needed to create an ideological weapon for the regents.
Okay.
So in a widely read tract, he looked back over 1,000 years to the Batavians. They were an ancient Germanic tribe that lived in the region during the Roman Empire.
Going way back.
Yeah. Grotius argued that the Batavians were an independent republic, and crucially, that they were ruled not by kings, but by an assembly of nobles and leading citizens, which he claimed was the ancient equivalent of the city regents.
Oh, that is incredibly clever. He is essentially saying, we aren't usurping power. We are the true inheritors of a 1,500-year-old tradition of liberty. And monarchs, or stadtholders acting like monarchs, are the real foreign aberration. It's pure historical retconning to justify current political power.
It was brilliant propaganda, and this Batavian myth became the core ideological armor of the state's party, the pro-regent faction, for the next 2 centuries.
So the 12 Years' Truce ends in 1621. The war with Spain resumes. But the Republic doesn't miss a beat economically. We enter phase 3 of their world trade primacy.
The expansion continues.
And this isn't just European trade anymore. This is the era of global corporations, the VOC. If you are a listener trying to understand how a tiny country runs a global empire, you have to understand the Dutch East India Company. How did this actually function mechanically?
The VOC was revolutionary. It was the world's first truly multinational joint stock corporation.
First of its kind.
Right. Before the VOC, trade to Asia was done by small, temporary companies. A few merchants would pool their money, buy a ship, send it to Indonesia for spices, and if it came back, they split the profits and dissolved the company.
High risk, but high reward. If the ship sinks, you go bankrupt.
Exactly. Oldenbarnevelt had realized this was inefficient and led to Dutch merchants undercutting each other. So, in 1602, he forced them all to merge into a single mega-corporation, the VOC.
A forced monopoly.
The States General granted the VOC a monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. But here is the critical mechanism. They didn't just give them a monopoly on trade, they outsourced state sovereignty.
What does that mean in practice?
The VOC was legally empowered to build forts, raise its own private armies, negotiate treaties with Asian monarchs, and wage war on behalf of the Dutch Republic.
A private company with a license to kill and conquer? That's insane.
Very much so.
But how did they raise the massive amounts of money needed to build fleets of warships and sail them around the globe?
By inventing modern finance, they opened the company up to public investment. Anyone in the Republic, a wealthy merchant, a baker, a servant who had saved a few guilders, could buy shares in the VOC at the Amsterdam Exchange.
So anyone could invest.
Right. You owned a fractional piece of the entire enterprise.
So a local blacksmith in Amsterdam literally owns a piece of a warship bombing a Portuguese fort in the Spice Islands and receives a dividend when the nutmeg comes back.
Yes. It aligned the financial interests of the entire population with the aggressive expansion of the empire.
And it was aggressive.
Very. They brutally monopolized the spice, trade nutmeg, mace, cloves, often through horrific violence against local populations in the Banned Islands.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, they created the WIC, the West India Company, to take the fight to the Spanish and Portuguese in the Americas.
Capturing sugar plantations in Brazil and dominating the Caribbean salt trade. But what I really want to know is, how does the art and the intellect fit into this volatile mix of brutal corporate monopolies, theological purges, and massive wealth? Because this exact same period is when Rembrandt is painting his masterpieces.
What's fascinating here is that the political and religious fragmentation we just spent all this time discussing is exactly what fuels the cultural explosion.
Wait, really? How so?
Let's look at the mechanics of the art market. In France, Spain, or Italy, art was entirely dominated by the central royal court and the Catholic Church. They dictated the style, the subjects, the philosophy.
So if you wanted to be a painter, you had to follow their rules.
Right, you painted massive biblical scenes for an altar or flattering portraits of a duke.
But in the Dutch Republic, the Calvinist church is completely stripped bare. They don't want paintings in their churches. And the stadtholder's court is relatively small. So who is paying for the art?
The free market, the wealthy middle class. You have tens of thousands of prosperous merchants, brewers, and civic guards who want to show off their wealth and decorate their canal houses.
So ordinary rich people are buying it up.
Yes. And because the market is so broad, painters are forced to compete and specialize to stand out. You don't just become a painter. You become a painter who only paints winter ice skating scenes, or only paints hyper-realistic breakfast tables, or only paints dramatic naval battles.
The specialization is wild because no single entity can control everything. Thousands of different creative niches are allowed to bloom.
Millions of paintings were produced. Art became so affordable that even ordinary craftsmen had original oil paintings hanging in their homes, which shocked foreign visitors.
I bet.
And intellectually, the lack of central censorship made the Republic a haven. Universities like Leiden became intellectual powerhouses. The newest and most radical ideas, like the mechanistic worldview of René Descartes, who lived and worked in the Netherlands for decades, flourished there.
Because there was no inquisition to stop him.
Gusly. There was no central unified inquisition powerful enough to stop him. If one city banned his books, he just moved to another city and published them there.
It is the ultimate evolutionary sandbox. But there is still that underlying political tension. The source gives this incredible little illustrative detail about the most famous poet of the age, Just van den Vondel.
Ah, yes. Vondel was the most celebrated playwright and poet of the Dutch Golden Age. And when the stadtholder, Frederik Hendrik, who was Morit's successor, died in 1647, it was entirely expected that Vondel, as the literary voice of the nation, would write a grand funerary poem extolling the prince's virtues.
It's just what you do when the head of state dies.
But Vondel remained completely conspicuously silent. He didn't publish a single word about the stadtholder's death.
It's the 17th century equivalent of an entire nation mourning on social media, and the biggest celebrity deliberately posting absolutely nothing. It shows that even at the absolute height of their wealth and cultural dominance, that deep, lingering divide between the proponents of the military stadtholder and the independent-minded citizens was still burning right beneath the surface.
And that tension is a ticking time bomb, which forces us into the third major shift, the later Golden Age, from 1647 to 1702. The period where they transition from what the regents call the true freedom into an absolute, unmitigated disaster.
Okay, so Frederik Hendrik is dead. His son, William II, assumes the office of stadtholder in 1647, and from what I read, this guy is young, hot-headed, and does not waste any time kicking over the hornet's nest.
Not at all. William II was deeply militaristic and ambitious. The context here is crucial. In 1648, the Republic finally signs the Peace of Münster. The 80 Years' War with Spain is officially permanently over.
So they won.
Yes. The logical next step for the province of Holland, which was still paying for roughly 60% of the massive standing army, was to drastically cut military spending and disband troops to lower taxes.
Right, the war is over, time to cash in the peace dividend. But if you're the stadtholder, the army is your entire power base, your source of patronage, and your prestige. You do not want to see it disbanded.
Exactly. So William II immediately clashes with the states of Holland. He tours the cities, trying to force them to maintain the troop levels. Holland refuses and begins unilaterally disbanding regiments that they pay for.
So Holland just stops paying.
Pretty much. So in 1650, William decides to replicate exactly what his uncle Moritz did in 1618. He stages a military coup.
And the details of this coup are just incredible. It feels like something out of a political thriller. How does he try to take down Holland?
He moves swiftly and secretly. First, he invites 6 of the princely regents of Holland, the leaders of the opposition, to a meeting, arrests them on the spot, and locks them up in Loevestein Castle.
Just takes them off the board.
But arresting a few politicians isn't enough. He needs to bring the financial engine of the Republic, the mighty city of Amsterdam, to heel. So he orders his cousin, Willem Frederik, to take a massive army of mercenaries and march on Amsterdam in complete secrecy through the middle of the night.
A sneak attack on your own country's capital city.
Yes. The plan was to arrive at the gates before dawn, seize the walls before the civic guard could mobilize, and occupy the city.
But something goes wrong.
An incredible twist of fate occurs, completely dependent on the Dutch weather. The troops are marching through the dark, terrible rain, and they get bogged down in the mud. And as they are struggling through the dark, they are spotted by a lone postal courier riding his routine route from Hamburg to Amsterdam.
Wait, the postman sees an entire army sneaking through the rain?
Yeah. The courier realizes exactly what's happening, rides his horse into the ground to get ahead of the army, and warns the burgomasters of Amsterdam.
By the time the stadholder's army finally trudges out of the mud, what do they see?
The element of surprise is completely ruined. The city gates are locked, the bridges over the canals are drawn up, and the civic militia is heavily armed and manning the artillery on the walls.
Wow. But William still has the professional army, right? He still has the upper hand, even if he can't surprise them.
He does. Amsterdam is rich, but it doesn't want a bloody siege that will destroy its trade. So they negotiate.
Standoff.
William negotiates from a position of strength, forcing Amsterdam to agree to his terms regarding maintaining the troops, and he purges his political enemies from the city council.
Yeah.
It looks like he has won. He has established total unassailable dominance over the Republic. He is poised to rule as a de facto absolute monarch.
But then,
And then the ultimate plot twist.
in November 1650, mere months after his triumph, at the absolute height of his power, he catches smallpox and dies. He's 24 years old.
The shock that sent through the Republic cannot be overstated. For the Orangists, the supporters of the stadtholder, it was a devastating, inexplicable loss of their invincible hero.
And for the regents.
For the regents who had just been bullied and imprisoned, it was seen as literal divine intervention. And crucially, William II's only child, the future William III, wasn't even born yet. He was born 8 days after his father's death.
Let me get this straight. Suddenly, there is no adult Prince of Orange to take command. The great military dictator is dead. His heir is a literal infant in a crib. And the wealthy merchants who were just purged are looking around realizing the guy with the gun is gone. We are in charge now.
This ushers in what historians call the first stadholderless era, a period from 1650 to 1672 that the regents proudly called the true freedom.
True freedom.
The provinces, led by Holland, simply decided they were not going to appoint a new stadtholder. The supreme power reverted entirely to the provincial assemblies and the States General. The military was placed strictly under civilian control.
Enter Johan de Witt.
Johan de Witt becomes the Grand Pensionary of Holland in 1653. He is perhaps the most brilliant, calculating statesman of the entire era. He is a mathematician, a lawyer, and a master politician.
A real Renaissance man.
And under his guidance, the ideology of the true freedom is fully articulated. The States Party argued that a true republic, by definition, cannot have an eminent head.
Because if you have an eminent head, a military hero standing above everyone else, it inevitably leads to them trying to become a king.
Precisely. They looked at history and political theory. The Orangists argued that a republic needed a figurehead to unify them, pointing to Venice and its Doge. But de Witt and the Republican theorists rejected that.
What model did they want?
They looked instead to the Swiss model. They envisioned the United Provinces as a defensive league of truly sovereign entities, a strict decentralized federalism where no single charismatic figure could usurp the liberty of the individual provinces.
And economically, this era of the true freedom under de Witt is an absolute powerhouse, isn't it?
It is the absolute zenith of their power, phase 4 of Dutch world trade primacy. Their export industries, the fine cloth, the refined sugar, the massive shipbuilding yards, are operating at maximum capacity.
Pumping out wealth.
They completely dominate the Baltic trade, the East Indies, the Mediterranean. The wealth flowing into the Amsterdam Exchange is staggering. Johan de Witt manages the public finances brilliantly, paying down debt and building a massive, highly professional war fleet to protect this global commercial empire from the English.
Okay, this is where I have to push back hard. You're telling me they are at the absolute peak of their wealth. They have Johan de Witt, a brilliant mathematical genius running the state finances. They have a massive navy, and they've perfected their Republican ideology.
Everything is going great.
So how do we get from that peak to 1672, a year so horrific that the Dutch literally call it the ramp jar, the year of disaster?
Yeah.
If they were so rich and powerful, how did they collapse almost instantly?
This cuts to the very core of the Dutch paradox, and it highlights the fatal flaw of their extreme decentralization. Johan de Witt's regime was entirely focused on maritime power and global trade, because that is what generated wealth for his province, Holland.
So they ignore the land.
To fund that massive navy, and out of a deep, lingering political paranoia about the Orangist-dominated army, de Witt allowed the land forces to wither.
Because the army was the traditional power base of the stadholders. If you fund a strong army, you are handing a weapon to your political enemies.
Exactly. The standing army was underfunded, undisciplined, and lacked experienced officers because the regents refused to hire foreign nobles they didn't trust. But the fatal flaw was the infrastructure. The physical land fortifications, the massive fortresses guarding the eastern and southern borders, were left to rot.
How does that happen?
And here's where decentralization kills them. The system dictated that provinces were responsible for their own defenses. Holland, being safe behind water, refused to pay to maintain fortresses in the eastern province of Gelderland.
So because they couldn't agree on a federal budget for defense, the border forts literally crumbled. And while they are looking out to sea at the English, ignoring their own backyard, a massive storm is gathering in France. King Louis XIV.
Louis XIV, the Sun King, has spent years building the most powerful, centralized professional army Europe has ever seen, and he despises the Dutch.
Why?
He hates their republicanism, he hates their Protestantism, and he is deeply jealous of their economic dominance. In 1672, he unleashes his massive army.
And it isn't even a fight, is it? Explain how the French bypass these defenses.
It's a total collapse. The French army simply bypasses the major, heavily defended river crossings by marching further east and crossing the Rhine River, where a severe drought had dropped the water levels. The French cavalry literally waded across the river.
He just walked across.
The vaunted eastern defensive lines fell almost without a shot. The underpaid mercenary garrisons in the forts simply surrendered. The French marched right into the heart of the Republic, occupying Utrecht, and are within striking distance of Amsterdam.
The psychological impact of realizing your country is entirely defenseless must have been apocalyptic.
It triggered the greatest financial crash on the Amsterdam Exchange in early modern times. The value of VOC shares plummeted instantly. Trade was completely paralyzed. The art market, which relied entirely on the disposable income of citizens who were suddenly terrified of losing everything, froze overnight.
Painters couldn't sell anything.
Yeah.
Building projects halted.
Everything stopped.
And the political fallout. Johan de Witt is the architect of the system that just failed spectacularly.
The panic turns into violent popular rage. The people blame the true freedom and the wealthy regents for leaving the country defenseless while they line their pockets. In sheer desperation, the provinces elevate the young William III, the son of the stadtholder who died of smallpox 22 years earlier, to the office of stadtholder.
They give him sweeping dictatorial powers to save the country.
They do.
And what happens to De Witt? We have to talk about this because it is one of the most shocking moments in political history.
De Witt is forced to resign. Shortly after, his brother is arrested on trumped-up charges of treason. When Johan goes to visit his brother in the prison in The Hague, a frantic, highly organized Orangist mob surrounds the prison.
And it gets ugly.
They drag the two brothers out into the street, beat them to death, strip them naked, hang them upside down from a gibbet, and then they mutilate the bodies, with parts of them allegedly being eaten by the mob.
The civilized, wealthy, rational center of global commerce devolves into mob cannibalism of its own leader in an afternoon. It is a horrific, traumatic end to the true freedom.
It illustrates the sheer terror of 1672. But young William III does manage to save the country.
How does he stop the French?
He halts the French advance, crucially by utilizing the Holland waterline, deliberately opening the sluices and flooding a massive swath of agricultural land between the French army and Amsterdam, turning the province of Holland into an untouchable island.
Wow, back to the mud and the water to save them. But surviving 1672 isn't the end of the story for William III. He goes on to do something even more audacious 16 years later, the Glorious Revolution of 1688.
Yes, a huge moment.
I always learned this in school as British history. King James II gets overthrown, and Parliament invites William and Mary to take over. But the sources frame this entirely differently.
Yes, the Glorious Revolution is often taught as an English constitutional milestone. But if we look at it through the lens of Dutch grand strategy, it was a vital existential military maneuver.
How so?
William III recognizes that the Dutch Republic, with its 2 million people, can never continuously defeat the massive demographic and military weight of Louis XIV's France on its own. France is an existential threat to Europe. If England, under the Catholic King James II, forms an alliance with France, the Republic will be crushed between them.
So William decides he just has to steal England to use as a shield.
He gambles everything.
Oh.
He takes the massive Dutch fleet and army, invades England, dethrones his own father-in-law James II, and is crowned King of England.
Just takes over the country.
But his primary motivation wasn't a desire to rule Britain. It was a desperate strategic necessity to permanently lock British naval power, British financial resources, and the British army into a grand anti-French alliance.
Hmm.
And it works. He successfully contains Louis XIV.
But at a terrible delayed cost. And this is the pivot to our final shift, the decline in denouement from 1702 to 1806. Because the Republic survives the wars against France and they put their own guy on the British throne. But the immense, staggering cost of fighting a superpower for 3 decades fundamentally breaks the Dutch economic engine.
It breaks them. We enter the 18th century, the age of decline, and Jonathan Israel makes a very crucial distinction here that we have to unpack. This wasn't just a relative decline.
What does that mean?
It wasn't just that England and France copied Dutch financial methods, built bigger navies, and caught up to them, though they did do that. It was an absolute economic contraction inside the Republic itself.
Meaning the economic pie wasn't just growing faster elsewhere. The Dutch pie was actively, physically shrinking. If I'm a merchant or a worker in 1720, how do I actually feel this contraction? What are the mechanics of this decline?
You feel it in taxes and wages.
Yeah.
To survive the French invasions, the Dutch state had to borrow astronomical sums of money. To pay the interest on those massive war bonds, the government had to continuously raise taxes, specifically excises, taxes on everyday goods like beer, bread, peat, and salt.
So the cost of simply staying alive skyrockets for the average worker.
Exactly. And because the cost of living is so high, wages have to remain high just so workers don't starve. But high wages mean that the products the Dutch manufacture, their cloth, their ships, their refined goods, become far more expensive than goods produced in England or France. The famous Dutch rich trades lose their competitive edge. The export markets collapse.
Think of it like a highly successful, innovative business that gets targeted by a massive, hostile corporate takeover. To fend off the takeover, they have to take out billions in high-interest loans. They survive, but now 80% of their revenue is just servicing the interest on that debt. It doesn't matter how good their product is anymore. They are physically suffocating under the weight of their own bond market.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And this leads to devastating urban decay. Deindustrialization sets in. Cities like Leiden and Haarlem, which were bustling industrial textile centers in the Golden Age, see their populations plummet.
People just leave.
It gets so bad that owners literally begin tearing down empty houses and abandoned factories just so they don't have to pay property taxes on them. The physical footprint of the cities shrinks. Poverty rises dramatically.
And I imagine the wealthy regions aren't investing in new factories anymore if exports are dead.
No, the wealthy elite transform into a rentier class. Instead of risking their money on trade voyages or new industries, they just take their massive inherited wealth and buy government bonds, living comfortably off the interest paid by the heavy taxes on the poor.
So the dynamism is completely gone.
Completely. Yeah. And as the economy contracts, the cultural institutions that relied on that wealth wither. The universities lose their edge. The mass market for painting that supported thousands of artists largely disappears.
And this is a massive, fascinating caveat in the text. Even as the economy rots, the factories close, and the political power fades globally, the Republic remains an incredible intellectual crucible. We get the radical Enlightenment. What is happening here, and why is it happening during a period of decline?
It's the unintended consequence of a weakening state. As the political center decays, and as the Orthodox Calvinist Church loses its iron grip on public morality, the internal barriers begin to loosen.
Right.
The society becomes even more fragmented, but in a way that allows highly subversive, radical ideas to flourish in the shadows.
We are talking about thinkers like Baruch Spinoza. Why is Spinoza so dangerous to the 17th century order?
Spinoza and the radical followers of Descartes are publishing works that challenge the very foundations of European society. Spinoza argued for a mechanistic universe, equating God with nature itself, which essentially strips away the idea of a personal intervening deity.
That's a huge shift.
He challenged the literal historical truth of the Bible. He argued for absolute freedom of thought and democratic republicanism. These ideas threatened to upend the authority of every king and every church in Europe.
If you publish that in France or Spain, you are burned at the stake. But how does Spinoza get away with publishing it in the Dutch Republic?
Because of the very decentralization we've been tracking. There was no unified national censorship apparatus. If the city magistrates of Amsterdam banned a controversial book to appease the local preachers, the publishers simply moved down the road to Utrecht or Leiden and printed it there, smuggling it back into Amsterdam.
So they just exploit the loopholes.
Exactly. The authorities either couldn't coordinate well enough or fundamentally didn't care enough to entirely stamp them out.
So the dying, decentralized Dutch Republic acts as the printing press for the intellectual dynamite that will eventually blow up the old European order. The foundations of the modern secular state are being hammered out in the decaying canal houses of a shrinking economy.
It is a profound legacy. These radical Dutch presses heavily fueled the broader European Enlightenment, deeply influencing thinkers across the continent, which would eventually spark the French Revolution.
Which is incredibly ironic because the French Revolution is exactly what finally puts the nail in the coffin of the Dutch Republic. Walk us through the final death throes of this 300-year experiment.
By the late 18th century, the internal structure finally fractures completely under the weight of economic stagnation and the influx of those new democratic ideals. You have the Patriot Revolution in the 1780s.
What was that?
This was a massive, armed, citizen-led movement demanding true democratic reforms. They had read the Enlightenment tracts, they looked at the corrupt regent oligarchies and the ineffectual stadtholder, and they demanded a voice.
The citizens finally trying to take control of this suffocating, debt-ridden business.
But it fails. The Patriot Revolution is crushed by a harsh Orangist counter-revolution, heavily backed by an invading Prussian army. But the old regime is living on borrowed time.
Enter the French.
In 1795, the armies of revolutionary France marched north. And just like in 1672, they cross the frozen rivers in the dead of winter and invade. The Dutch patriots rise up again to support the French, the stadtholder flees to England, and the old republic is dead.
The Union of Utrecht, that foundational document that tied the sovereign provinces together, is formally scrapped.
Yes, it is replaced by the Batavian Republic. But this wasn't the old Dutch system. It was essentially a centralized client state taking its orders from Paris.
So they lost their independence.
The unique, messy, highly localized experiment of the sovereign provinces was forcefully ended. They were forced into the standard, centralized European model of a unified nation-state. And eventually, Napoleon Bonaparte simply absorbs the entire country directly into the French Empire in 1806, abolishing even the pretense of Dutch independence.
Okay, let's take a massive step back and look at this entire staggering trajectory from the mud of 1477 to the French annexation in 1806. We set out to synthesize how their weird political setup, their wealth, and their art were linked. If you had to distill the absolute core thesis of this history, what is the grand takeaway?
The core thesis we have to arrive at is that the Dutch miracle was entirely and fundamentally a product of its fragmentation. Because there was no central monarch who could enforce a single religion, dictate a unified economic policy, or censor intellectual thought across the board, a bizarre, highly localized evolutionary ecosystem was allowed to develop.
Because Amsterdam didn't have to listen to a king in The Hague, it could optimize its entire civic and legal structure to maximizing global trade and finance. Because the university in Leiden wasn't controlled by a central inquisition, it could harbor radical philosophers. Because there was no massive central court dictating artistic taste, painters were forced to compete in a specialized free market, leading to unparalleled innovation.
The lack of a strong center allowed the individual parts to optimize themselves to a degree never before seen in European history. That was the secret engine of the Golden Age.
But there is a massive, tragic, historical irony here. The engine of their success is exactly what killed them.
It is. The tragic irony is that the very same structural decentralization that prevented tyranny and fostered this explosive economic and cultural growth was the exact same structural weakness that doomed them.
They just couldn't come together when it mattered.
Because they were so fiercely decentralized, they couldn't coordinate a unified defense. They couldn't agree to fund the land army or maintain the border forts. They were fundamentally incapable of defending their land borders against a centralized, absolutist state like France in 1672.
Right.
And the crushing financial cost of trying to survive that existential threat eventually suffocated their economy, allowing them to be swallowed whole by the massive, centralized nation-states of Britain and France. Their greatest superpower was, inevitably, their fatal flaw.
It is a stunning historical arc, and it leaves you with a thought that is hard to shake. When you look at our own modern world, we are increasingly relying on highly decentralized, globally distributed systems.
We really are.
We celebrate our decentralized internet, our complex global supply chains, our borderless digital economies. We praise them for their immense dynamism, their rapid innovation, and their freedom from central, top-down control. They're very much like the Dutch Golden Age.
It's a very similar mindset.
But the story of the Dutch Republic forces you to ask a really uncomfortable question. Does the very lack of central control that creates a golden age of innovation and wealth inevitably guarantee its own destruction the moment a unified, centralized crisis comes knocking at your door? It is something to ponder long after we finish today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Keep asking questions, keep looking for the why behind the history, and we will catch you next time.